The topic I'm going to talk about is how Ghana can, as a beacon of democratic good practice, showcase its success across the Commonwealth. So presumably, for starters, Ghana is a beacon of democratic good process. What I'm going to do is first establish that credential, and then we are going to take a snapshot of the Commonwealth and the state of democracy within the Commonwealth. And then finally, having established that, we'll find out how Ghana can leverage their status as a beacon across the Commonwealth. So let's start first with Ghana's status. And Lord Ahmad said it, 7 straight elections since 1992. That's incredible, especially here on the African continent. But in between that, we have had 3 successful turnovers, change of government from one party to the other, which is also very remarkable for Ghana. And we've consolidated our democracy over the years. But as Chief Emeka Ayoku, who is a former Secretary General of the Commonwealth, once said, we must perceive democracy not in terms of set concepts, but in terms of essential ingredients. So what are the essential ingredients that makes Ghana so successful? And I'll talk about this knowing full well that the international community tends to often put a lot of leverage on elections and successful elections and free and fair elections. But then what happens from post to post? What happens between one elections and the other? Is there enough practices that support the opinion that there's enough democratic practices within a country? And we say this also because when you look at the Afrobarometer, when you look at the Mo Index, and also when you look at the Freedom House Index, it appears that even for countries in Africa that score so high when it comes to democratic practices, the citizens, and especially the young people, are not always impressed with the implementation of democracy within these countries. So, free and fair elections. Ghana obviously scores very high on that. We've had 7 straight ones. We had one last year, which led to a successful change in government. But what are the other indicators? Well, first, let's look at majority rule. Obviously, if you get 50 plus 1%, you have the majority. How about the interest of minorities? And I think Ghana has done quite well embracing different minorities in this country. We are blessed enough not to have too many ethnic skirmishes within the country. But in 2006, we passed a Disability Act, and within a 10-year period or less, we were supposed to ensure that our facilities were up to scratch and that people with a disability had equal access and had equal opportunities within the country. Have we been able to meet up to that in line with our democratic credentials? I remember one of my friends from law school who literally had to petition the presidency to get a job at the AG's department simply because he was visually impaired, although he was one of the most brilliant students in my class in 2013. So perhaps Ghana still has a lot to do when it comes to the issue of embracing minority rights and ensuring that everybody is well taken care of, which takes me to the subject, rather touchy subject, of transparency and accountability. Where do we fare? I think Ghana, perhaps among most African countries, has the best set of laws to ensure that, as much as possible, governance is as transparent and accountable as possible. Sadly, that doesn't make it foolproof when it comes to transparency and accountability. And in the last few years, we've had our own share of scandals, which transcended just one institution of government. And so we've had the executive and serious cases of embezzlement of project monies. I won't mention the specifics because you are all familiar with these ones. And then we have had the judiciary, who were famously caught napping when Anas did his famous expose on corruption within the judiciary. And just when we thought the saints among the lot were the legislature, we had a bombshell within the appointment process of a minister when it was alleged that there was a bribery scandal. And just when we thought that was over, we heard about monies that were supposed to be paid to parliamentarians so they can do their basic job of ensuring that the legislation that is passed is the best legislation. And so, yes, we might be a beacon, but when it comes to the issue of transparency and accountability, Ghana still does have a long way to go. You probably get the trend. We are not yet there, although we may pride ourselves with the fact that we have come far. And then I'll talk about the issue of equality. And equality in terms of our resource, and equality also in terms of opportunities and wealth within the country. Ghana is blessed with natural resources. And the oil that was supposed to bless us still becomes a source of strife in this country because we haven't benefited as much as we should benefit. And increasingly, as you are all privy to, the wealth gap between the people who do not have and the people who have is expanding within the country. And it's something that has to be looked at. Sadly enough, and when you listen to Bernard every morning on CTFM, he says it without end. How the people who are supposed to benefit from the resources of the country have not benefited from the resources as expected. So Ghana may be a beacon, but let's just say that that beacon is still finding its brightness, but it's not yet there. We are supposed to be an example unto the Commonwealth. So what sort of Commonwealth do we have in terms of democracy? Democracy is one of the key pillars of the Commonwealth. And in 1991, in Harare, when there was the Harare Declaration, it was clear that democracy, democratic processes, and democratic institutions must be in line with people's national interest. The kinds of democracy in the Commonwealth are as diverse as the type of countries and cultures within the Commonwealth, which forms a quarter of the world's population. But generally, there are trends that can be aggregated together. So I'll attempt the difficult job of aggregating the trends of democracy within the Commonwealth. Recently, the Economist Intelligence Unit put together a very interesting list, which had Commonwealth countries like New Zealand being in the extremely good books, and then countries like Swaziland being at the extreme end. Of course, it's an absolute monarch, and the monarch takes orders from nobody, including the people. But generally, you can trace that there are those countries that have successfully implemented Westminster kind of democracy. And those are the countries that have had a longer relationship with the United Kingdom that essentially are offshoots of the United Kingdom. And so you have Australia, you have Canada, and then you have countries like New Zealand who have mastered the art of Westminster democracy. And then in the middle, you have countries that have stable democracies that are, however, occasionally tainted with all sorts of upheavals. And so you might have the ethnic clashes, you might have the occasional authoritarian rule or persecution of people within a particular religion or not. And India, Sri Lanka, and indeed some of the Caribbean countries fall within this particular area. Let me just say that ideally I would put Botswana in the first category of successful democracies because Botswana is the most successful African country in terms of longevity of democracy. Since 1965, they have continuously had successful elections. So let's come to the third category. The third category, often described as unstable democracies, where their democracy has been in leaps and bounds. Unfortunately, the instability reflects itself in coup d'etats, in the occasional strongman seizing power and managing the affairs of the country with a promise to organize elections which do not happen, and the occasional ethnic clashes and persecution of minority groups. And I don't have to mention the countries. There are several of them, especially here in Africa, where you have Ghana at a point falling within this category, Nigeria falling into this category, Uganda falling into this category, Kenya also falling into this category, and a lot more. You could add Cameroon to the list, Paul Biya's Cameroon. So that is a snapshot of the Commonwealth. And as you can see, it's a mixture of everything. And so if you're going to be a beacon, it's important to know who the target of your inspiration or your impact must be. So now, let's look at Ghana's role in all this. And I look at it in two ways. There's a passive role and there's an active role. Passively, obviously, to be a beacon, your democracy must continue to grow. And I think it's essential for Ghanaians not to be complacent and not to perceive that there will be a genuflection of African countries or Commonwealth countries before them saying, teach us what you have done. We are still work in progress, and it's essential that we recognize that we can get better. So passively speaking, we can further improve our institutions, deal with corruption, deal with issues of accountability, deal with issues of minorities and their interests within the country. And in doing so, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Botswana has been described as an African success story for one reason only. From Sir Seretse Khama's period, they have enjoyed the benevolence of the West and indeed the world. And they have enjoyed goodwill, which has brought enormous amounts of direct investment. Ghana is enjoying that right now. The last UNCTAD figures show that we are only one of 5 countries who saw increases in our foreign direct investment. So we are enjoying that kind of goodwill, and it can be even better for us in terms of investment coming into the country. Actively, and we have already started doing several of that. having organized 7 elections makes you an experienced organizer of elections. We've already outsourced several of our skills to other African countries to enable them also organize some of their elections. We have outsourced our judges to countries like Gambia. Unfortunately, the last judge literally had to run for her life because Yahya Jammeh thought that she was making decisions that weren't in her interest. And so actively we can do that. But then comes the practical challenges. How do you convert somebody who is not interested in being converted? Which leads us to look at very critical issues that must be identified in order for us to be able to have an impact on the African continent. I'll start with the first one. The tradition in Africa is that you'd rather not interfere in somebody's domestic affairs. And so you'd rather not tell them in the face when it matters. And so it was only a few weeks ago that Ghana's president was in Zambia. And Edgar Lunga, the president of Zambia, told our president that there are many things that Zambia can learn from Ghana in mining, agriculture, construction, and other areas. The one thing he didn't mention was our democratic development. And it was at a time when Hakainde Hichilema, who is the opposition leader, was in jail. His offense being he failed to move his convoy off the road when the president's convoy was coming, for which reason he was charged with treason. The issue never came up during our president's visit. In any case, Zambia has only had, the last time they had a state of emergency was 20 years ago in 1997 because of a coup d'etat which failed. Well, 20 years on, the president has decided to evoke similar powers for the reason of ensuring that civil society and other people do not clamor as much as they should. But the niceties of our diplomatic practice meant that this never came up when Ghana's president visited Zambia in recent years. Then comes the other thing. And there are those who think that there has to be dividends of democracy. Necessarily, there has to be some form of economic development for you to justify why democracy is the way to go. But how hard can it be for a country that is growing in its democracy when the other country that it would rather like to preach democratic credentials to is better developed than it? And within the African context, one crucial example would be something like Rwanda. There are those that will say Rwanda is not as democratic as Ghana, that Rwanda has human rights issues. But then how do you convince the people of Rwanda who are enjoying massive economic benefit and who are seen as where Ghana should be and where Ghana should evolve to be? How then do you convince them? You only convince them when you have your own economic achievements to boast of, and which is something that Ghana should be aiming at doing, so that you don't have to actively do anything, but you become the shining example to anybody else who aspires to have your democratic credentials. The next thing that comes is, as a generation, well, the Harare Declaration was in 1991. A lot has changed since then. One of the crucial things is ICT. And now we are talking about e-democracy, digital democracy. And the absence of access to the digital world is seen as a source of social exclusion or the possibility of creating social inclusion. And so you ask yourself, African presidents have a new hobby, which is to switch off the internet when people become too loud. And we saw that in Cameroon in recent times when the people in Bamenda and in the northwest were clamoring about unfavorable policies. Here comes the plane. The fact that the government switched off the internet tells you how crucial technology is to our generation in terms of expressing ourselves. In Rwanda, you have the government laying fiber across every aspect of the country, which means that everybody has access to the internet. Traditionally, you need access to the editor of a newspaper or to the corridors of government in order to be heard. But now you can be heard via social media. You can be heard via the internet. Our ability to create opportunities for everybody to tap into this ICT, to tap into this connectivity, to tap into this digital world is one of the first steps of empowering people to be able to express themselves across the country. So in short, because I have just 15 minutes, is Ghana a beacon of democracy? It certainly is. But it's not the brightest beacon of democracy in the Commonwealth. It is work in progress, work that can be improved, and work that can get to the state of perfection. Can we shine bright enough? Well, it was Friedrich Nietzsche who said that they that dance are perceived to be insane by they who do not hear the music. So the governments that are not as democratic as we are, that cover themselves with elections which are often corrupt and fraudulent, will only aspire to become like Ghana if the music we are playing is loud enough for them to hear. Not just the sound, but to hear the lyrics, which talks about good democratic processes. And so, yes, we can get there, but there's a lot of work to do, and I believe in the power of the Commonwealth, gradually, with reforms, and despite the challenges of all the multiplicity of regional and other groupings, to be able to ensure democracy within the Commonwealth. So thank you very much for listening to me tonight.